Hey guys, Will here. So it seems like at the moment, every other week, we're checking out a new entry-level direct drive package, and today is no exception. We've got the brand new Asetek Initium range here in the studio. So there's a brand new 5.5 Newton meter direct drive motor, which is upgradable to 8 Newton meters, a new steering wheel, and a new set of pedals. And upgradability is going to be a big part of today's story. So as anybody that's been watching this channel for a while would know, this is entering a very saturated part of the market as it stands right now in the latter half of 2025. So is the Asetek Initium range worth a look at? That's what we're going to be finding out in today's video, so stick around. So we do have a lot of things to get through today, but firstly, before we get started, a quick thank you to Asetek for sending across this gear for us to check out. Now, as is always the case here at Boosted Media, we will be making some comparisons against some competitor products. So it's important that you guys are aware that everything that we will be talking about in today's video is all sent to us under the exact same conditions. Now, if you do decide you want to pick up any of the gear that you see in today's video, or any other sim racing gear for that matter, head over to boostedmedia.net or just follow the links down in the description below. There you will find a whole bunch of discount codes and affiliate links, which are an awesome way of saving yourselves a little bit of money and helping support us at no additional cost in the process. We really appreciate your support there. But as is always the case, no third party has any sort of input whatsoever into anything that we'll be talking about today. Everything we'll be talking about today is just my own opinions and my own observations of these products and their competitor products. So with that all said, let's dive into these new products. Now, the first thing I want to do before we even talk about pricing is clear up a bit of misunderstanding, a bit of confusion around the naming of these products, because you guys will be familiar with Asetek Sim Sports, but this new stuff is being marketed as Asetek Racing. Now, when their new packaging with this blue color came out a couple of weeks ago, a lot of people were confused, thinking that it meant that there was PlayStation compatibility. Now, unfortunately, that is not the case. I know Asetek have been working really hard to try and get the attention of Sony. And I know a lot of people are asking, why don't Asetek have PlayStation compatibility at this time? Look, it's not up to them to decide, unfortunately. I don't want to sound like I'm defending them, but Sony is extremely protective of their brand image and their user experience. And getting your gear supported by them officially is notoriously difficult. So it's not that Asetek aren't trying, it's just a very long and drawn out process. So unfortunately, at the time of filming, this gear is only PC compatible. However, there will be an Xbox compatible wheel, which, like other ecosystems, once you put that Xbox compatible wheel onto your wheelbase, all the other gear within that ecosystem becomes Xbox compatible as well. Now, that won't be the case with PlayStation compatibility because the security chip is inside the base itself. So that won't be something that you'll just be able to buy a wheel or a USB dongle or something like that to unlock. So in the case of Xbox, it will be coming soon. So why Asetek Racing and not Asetek Sim Sports? So I spoke directly with the CEO of Asetek, Andre Eriksson, and he told me that Asetek Racing is like a sub-brand that is intended for marketing at retail. So it's a little bit more clear exactly what the products are all about. It makes them stand out a little bit more on retail shelves as opposed to the Asetek Sim Sports gear, which is more geared and marketed towards the more hardcore sim racers. So hopefully that clears up any confusion there. Let's get in now and talk about pricing. So I don't want to get completely bogged down in all this pricing information. As I touched on earlier, this is a very saturated part of the market now. So we've put together a comprehensive direct drive buyer's guide over on boostedmedia.net. Again, I'll drop a link down in the description below for you guys if you want to check it out. And that, combined with our written version of this same review, will cover all the various different pricing and comparisons against competitor products there as well. So that is going to be the best way to get a breakdown of exactly where this sits in comparison to competitor products. But just to give you the basic breakdown here, remembering we do have a 5% discount code available for Asetek Sim Sports, linked down below. But the Initium base on its own, you're looking at $349 US, excluding taxes and shipping. For the two pedal set here, you're looking at $119 US, again, plus taxes and shipping. And the wheel, you're looking at $149 US. Now, they do have the three of these available as a bundle for $599 US. And there is also a bundle that includes a cockpit available as well. Unfortunately, I don't have the cockpit here in the studio to test out for you guys. Hopefully we'll get our hands on it a little bit further down the track. Drop a comment down below if you would like to see that. But that bundle with all this gear plus the cockpit is available at $1,049 US. So you can basically get up and running with a full rig just for going a screen and a PC or console for just a touch over $1,000 US, which is pretty good value. Although again, it is a very saturated part of the market. So there are plenty of other good bundles available at that kind of price as well that will get you up and running with everything you need. So before we move on into the hardware specifics, I mentioned earlier upgradability. Now, I mentioned that the 5.5 Newton meter wheelbase wheelbase is upgradable to 8 Newton meters. That is going to be via an upgraded power supply, very similar, or if not, in fact, identical to the upgrade available for the CSL DD to take it from 5 Newton meters to 8 Newton meters via the boost pack. So that upgraded power supply unfortunately isn't available just yet, so we didn't have our hands on it to test it out, but that will be available a little bit later on for $89 US ex taxes. And again, that will take the base from 5.5 Newton meters continuous up to 8 Newton meters continuous torque. So that will be a nice little upgrade there, and I'm keen to test that out a little bit later on. Now, the upgrades don't stop with the wheelbase. There are also a bunch of upgrade options available for these pedals, and these pedals have really impressed me, as you'll see as we get through today's video. So there is a clutch pedal upgrade available. You can see the spot for the blank hole for it just there. So you're looking at $39 US for that additional pedal. There's also an upgrade kit available for the throttle pedal for $119 US, and that'll upgrade the throttle pedal to feel more similar to Asetek's more expensive pedals as well. So it will have adjustable preload and so forth. Now, again, unfortunately, I don't have that in the studio right now to test out, but we will check that out a little bit further on down the line if there is enough interest. And then when it comes to the brake, you can also upgrade from the default position-based brake pedal to the Initium load cell brake kit for $119 US extra. Or if you're really keen, you can even upgrade this to the new Thorpe 2 hydraulic system for $329 US. But as you'll see as we get on through today's video, I actually don't think that you should just assume that you will need to upgrade this brake. I think you might be quite surprised at just how well this thing does with the adjustability that comes as standard. So we'll cover that a little bit later on, but let's jump in now to the specifics about each one of these bits of hardware. So let's start off with the Initium wheelbase. For those of you who might have skipped straight to this part of the video, 5.5 Newton meters of max torque out of the box, upgradable to 8 Newton meters via the upgraded power supply, which we don't have here to test at the moment, but we'll check out a little bit later on. So we've got a cast aluminium housing here. I didn't notice any issues with temperature or drop off in performance at any time through our testing. So that seems to be all good in terms of thermal management. We've got a plastic front cover and rear housing, just like what we saw with Asetek's other model bases. And then we've got the standard Asetek quick release on the front here as well. Now, if you have a keen eye, you may have noticed this looks a little bit different from what you'll find on Asetek's other bases, at least at the time that we tested those. This little part on the front here is basically just a little cover that protects the pin assembly here, the little pogo pins, from any damage by accidental contact. So a nice little addition there, but otherwise operates in exactly the same manner as what we've seen with the other Asetek bases over the years. Now, these little pins here on the front, if you're not familiar with Asetek's ecosystem, do deliver power and data via standard USB protocol to the nose of the wheelbase. So that means that not only can you run any of the wheels within Asetek's own ecosystem, with exception of the Forte and Invicta wheels with the inbuilt screens. I'm not sure if support will be added for those later on, but at the time of testing, those are not compatible. But most other third-party wheels can be used directly on this wheelbase without having to have a cable running back to your PC. Now, I say most and not all, because we did test this with some of GSI's more high-end wheels, and we did have issues with the base not supplying enough current to power some of those. But anything in the sort of low to mid-range, which is more than likely where most people that are looking at this kind of hardware would be placed in the market anyway, we didn't have any issues with any of those wheels at all. So for the most part, you should be able to use pretty much any wheel you want without having to run a USB cable back to your PC. Now, that is quite an advantage over any other ecosystem within this kind of area of the market. With Fanatec, for example, unless you use a third-party emulator, which support is never guaranteed because it's third-party, you do have to use one of their relatively expensive universal hubs to connect other wheels. And unless you do that, force feedback is actually locked out completely from you. So look, while Asetek's wheel side quick release adapters are a little bit on the expensive side compared to some other ecosystems, the fact that they are passing through generic USB protocol to the nose of the wheel instead of some proprietary protocol is definitely a good thing. So beyond that, in our particular example, it did operate exactly the same way as their other bases. Now, in our testing, we didn't have any issues with slop or play in the quick release at all. One thing I did notice, I'm not 100% certain exactly what the material is that they've used here for the quick release. It's not cold to the touch like it is on the La Prima, Forte, and Invicta bases. So I think that this is some sort of a carbon or glass reinforced plastic material, similar to what we see on the pedals here. But in any case, it is a cast or molded piece, which means that there will be some level of manufacturing tolerance there or variation. So I can't absolutely guarantee that you'll have exactly the same experience with no slop or play like we did. But yeah, in our testing, it was absolutely fine. There isn't an native front mount option on the base itself, although I do believe it is compatible with Asetek's front mount adapter. But yeah, as you would have seen in my previous reviews of Asetek wheelbases, I just feel like that's a little bit over-engineered. But on the bottom, we do have this standard Asetek mount. I'll put the dimensions for the mounting pattern up on the screen for you now, but you can see it's actually done with a couple of T-nuts that go into the slots here. So you can actually adjust the spacing forward to back, but from side to side, it is fixed. And they do also include a nice little table clamp here as well, which is made of solid steel. And look, while it isn't completely flex free, most often at these kind of torque levels, the table is going to be moving around a lot more than something like this is going to move around anyway. So I think that's a good inclusion, and it definitely gets the job done. And then if we flip the base around to the rear, you can see the various inputs and outputs on the back here. So we've got our power input here. We've got our PC connection, which is USB-C. And then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 USB ports here for connecting external peripherals, as well as our little momentary switch here for powering off and on the base and putting it into safe mode, which we'll look at a little bit later on in today's video. So that is a basic rundown on the external side of things. In terms of internals, we do have an encoder resolution of 14-bit, which gives it 16,384 points of resolution throughout a 360-degree rotation. That is a little bit on the low side compared to some other competitor products in this part of the market. And I'll get into the reasons why that may have an impact on your driving experience when we get into that part of the video a little bit later on. But just to give you the point of reference here, the PXN VD4 and VD6 that we looked at just recently has an encoder resolution of 24-bit, which puts it in the millions of points of resolution throughout the rotation as opposed to the tens of thousands. The Moza R5 latest revision has a 15-bit encoder, which gives it around double the resolution, around 32 or 33,000 points of resolution throughout a full rotation. So that's everything I think you need to know about the wheelbase before we get into the driving experience a little bit later on. So let's take a look now at the Initium wheel. Now, this one is going to be a bit of a polarizer. And look, when I opened up the box, yeah, I probably don't even need to say, I don't like the look of this wheel. Ergonomically, it is absolutely fine. And we'll get into that in just a minute. But just to look at, it just looks very toy-like. And I mean, I guess I got to ask you guys, would you rather have something that looks like this on your sim rig, or would you rather have something that looks like the wheel that comes with the PXN VD4 bundle, which is significantly cheaper than this bundle, by the way? I mean, obviously it has other shortcomings compared to this, but this to me looks like the kind of thing that you would find in a race car. You know, it looks a little bit toyish with the buttons and encoders and bits and pieces, but it looks a lot more race car-esque than something like this does. And I get what they're trying to do here. They're trying to make it look like a gaming device, so it's more appealing to gamers. But look, my subjective opinion here is that the wheel design is a little bit of a miss. But look, let me know in the comments down below what you guys think about that. But that is all subjective. Objectively, it is a good wheel. The button quality is absolutely fine. It does come with a nice little sticker sheet as well with all the common functions there available. It does have RGB backlighting and an RGB addressable RPM strip here, which we'll take a look at in the software section a little bit later on. But yeah, look, the button feel is absolutely fine. It's nice and snappy. The D-pad is nice and snappy here as well. And yeah, look, I don't have any major complaints in terms of the actual physical quality of the unit. Just the design language doesn't quite sit 100% with me. Interestingly, it does have this little start-stop button in the middle here, which is like an emergency stop button. So when you press that, it puts the base into safe mode, same as if you tap the button on the back of the base. So in lieu of a separate emergency stop button, you do have that option, which is quite nice. But otherwise, we've got 11 assignable push buttons on the front, 2 rotary encoders, which do have relatively good quality feel to them. There's no excessive wiggle or play there, and they do have a nice firm snap in each position. A little bit vague when driving with gloves on, but for a wheel of this price point, I am certainly not complaining. One little quality thing we did notice during our testing is that these caps on the rotary encoders do just pull off very, very easily. It's just a little keyway there, you can see, to line it up correctly. But yeah, I do think that if you have a habit of fidgeting with these, you may well inadvertently knock one loose and lose it. So yeah, we'll just have to see how that goes. But look, nothing that can't be fixed with a little bit of Teflon tape around it, or even just a little bit of glue to stick it in place. But look, when we notice these things, we always call them out. So this is no exception. We've got a nice rubber grip here as well. And this is ergonomically molded, which does make it nice and comfortable. The 300mm diameter and round design does make it nice and versatile to drive with as well. With these kinds of bundles, I always look for a wheel around the sort of 280 to 300mm mark. Anything larger than that, you start to have too much of a damping effect on the force feedback. So that is definitely a good choice. And a round wheel is a good choice as well because it means you can slide it nice and easily through your hands for doing things like drifting and so forth. So some good design choices there in terms of the actual functionality of the wheel. It's just the design language, as I said before, that I'm not a huge fan of. Now, just to quickly talk about materials here, you can see this same glass infused plastic material used throughout the entire faceplate here. That does extend around the back as well, and it actually looks quite nice and classy. The same kind of materials you'll find on the SimMagic Neo wheel if you've seen one of those in the flesh before, and we're seeing this used much more commonly in sim racing gear in the last couple of years. It provides a lot of rigidity, relatively lightweight, and cheaper to manufacture than genuine carbon fiber. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense why they would have used it. No issues at all in terms of flex or rigidity. That was all absolutely fine for the price point, and you can see it extends around the back here as well with the same infused plastic, and you can see that extends all the way down to the quick release mechanism here. So it is all one piece. You can't replace that quick release and then use it with a with another brand's wheelbase if you wanted to do that, even though it is a standard USB protocol through to the wheel itself. So mechanically, the weak point on this wheel is, and you guys have heard me say this before about Asetek products, but the shifters I was disappointed with. They are quite rattly. As you can hear there, you can hear something sort of reverberating around inside. They do have little felt pads there to quieten them down a bit. If you just let go of them like that, they are quite loud, but when you're driving, if you keep it damped with your finger, it's not too loud. I know that's one thing that they were paying attention to when they designed this. Andre said it in his launch video that they wanted them to be nice and quiet, so you didn't bother other people in the room. That was actually something that Andre and I butted heads over years and years and years ago now when I interviewed him. He called me Mr. Sensitive Ears when I said that it's important that sim racing gear is nice and quiet. So I'm glad that he came around and took that to heart eventually at least. But yeah, look, and again, it is a very cheap wheel, but there are other cheap wheels on the market that have objectively nicer feeling shifters than what these are. So definitely a weak point there. But look, they do the job. They're nice and snappy at least, but yeah, they just don't have a quality feel to them. So whether or not you think that's acceptable for the price point, I'll leave up to you to decide. You've seen them now, so you can choose for yourself. So that's a quick rundown on the wheel. Remembering again, there will be an Xbox compatible version of this wheel a little bit further down the line as well, which will give you Xbox compatibility across the entire ecosystem when used in conjunction with that wheel. So definitely looking forward to checking that out a little bit further down the line. But let's have a look now in more detail at these Initium pedals. So, Initium pedals. Now, we've already talked briefly about the upgradability. We'll touch on that a little bit as we get through this technical analysis of these pedals. But yeah, I want to start this off by saying, straight out of the box, these are easily the best pedals that I've ever tested at this kind of price point. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but we'll talk about that as we get on through. So there's a couple of things that they've done here that are really interesting. Firstly, as you can see in this footage here, you do have the ability to switch these pedals between a couch or desk setup and a sim rig style setup. Now what that does is it tilts the pedals further forward. So this is in the sim rig configuration right now. What you can do is you can actually have the pedals tilt back a little bit more by default so that when you've got them on the carpet, you can push them down a little bit more easily. So when you're driving on a couch or at a desk or something like that, you're sitting a lot more upright and you have to kind of push down on the pedals rather than pushing forward on your pedals. And that's not good driving technique in general. I always say with a high-end set of load toe pedals, something like that, hydraulics, you always want to be pushing with your thigh rather than your ankle. But with entry-level pedal sets where you've got that kind of ergonomic limitation, you do need to be able to push down on the pedals relatively easy. So the angle and the ergonomics become extremely important. So you can set them up in that configuration, and you can see in this footage here, all we have to do is just undo the screws, and then there's a little plate inside that you can spin around, realign, and then bolt it all back together. So yeah, you have the option to switch between both, which I think is really excellent. Every other pedal set that I've ever tested that was designed to be used on carpet or on the floor was very limited in that sense. So if you wanted to end up using it on a sim rig, you'd have a lot of limitation there. And I've always said, you know, it has to be a compromise, because if you make the pedal too stiff or have too much definition, then it's just gonna slide across the floor and you're not gonna be able to drive with it at all. So having that adjustability, that adaptability here, I think is absolutely amazing in a pedal set of this kind of price point. And I don't say that lightly. These things have really, really, really impressed me. So then you got your little spring stack here as well. And it comes by default with a softer spring inside it. Doesn't have any elastomers like what you'll see in a lot of other gear, but you can see how simple this is in its design. It is all this glass reinforced plastic material with a plastic housing here. So there's no grease or anything like that involved. I didn't have any issues with squeaking or anything like that, although I did notice there is quite a bit of scoring just from driving with this throughout the last couple of weeks testing. So, you know, it will wear down over time, at least to some extent, but I think that that will end up sort of, smoothing out and becoming less of an issue over time rather than just grinding away to the point where it breaks apart. So I don't see that being a major issue by any means. It's more just a little bit of cosmetic scraping there that you can see. But if we pull this thing apart, it's actually really clever the way they've designed it. So one of the things that Asetek have always talked about with their pedals is trying to achieve a real life race car type feel. Now that is quite subjective, and there's all sorts of arguments about whether pedal travel should be long or short, stiff, soft, you name it. Everybody has an opinion on that, and I'm not going to get into that today. But what I can tell you is that in the context of sim racing, having a clearly defined threshold point that you can modulate your braking around is fundamental in lieu of a lot of the other sort of G-force effects and seat of the pants feel that you have in a real life race car to being able to brake with precision and consistency. So what they've done here is they've got one spring internally, and this is actually the stiffer of the two springs. It comes by default with a much softer spring. So that goes inside there. I'll leave the soft spring in it for now. And then you've actually got a second stage here, as you can see, a little keeper spring that sits inside here. So just like with their more expensive pedals, you have a second stage in your braking. What that means is that you can brake to the end of the first stage, and that gives you a clearly defined threshold point in your braking that you can hit consistently every single time. And then you can modulate very accurately around that threshold point to increase or decrease your braking, and then trail brake off into the corner. So between those two springs, it actually has a really good feel. Not so much in the softer setting, because obviously it needs to be soft enough that you can use it on carpet without it sliding around all over the place. And it will slide a little bit depending on the carpet type you have, but generally speaking, I think it's absolutely fine. So you don't have a whole lot of definition in that soft setting, but when you switch it across to the hard setting, you do feel that very clearly defined threshold point, just like what you would find in a much more expensive set of pedals. So one thing you may have noticed is that there's absolutely no electronics in this little module at all, unlike a lot of other load cell pedals where you'll find the load cell actually encased within the same assembly. So when you push down on the spring or elastomer stack, you're exerting a force upon the strain gauge or load cell in the back of the unit. What they've done with these pedals, I think, is actually quite genius. So what they've done, we'll pop that back into position. There's a Hall effect sensor built into the bottom of the pedal. You can actually see the little sensor for the clutch pedal there already in place. So there's a Hall effect sensor just like that for each one of the three pedals, and that is able to detect the relative position of each pedal. Now, because we're limiting the physical travel via the spring stack here, but we're not actually reducing the full range of detection of the sensor, what that means is you can push the pedal to that threshold point. And it's not like when you're using a normal, entry-level position-based brake pedal where you push to 100%, your foot goes all the way to the floor, and that's the end of your measurement range. You push any harder and you don't get any reading beyond that 100%. You can calibrate this so that when you push to that threshold point, that is, say, your 80% threshold point. And then as you modulate around that, because the pedal is being limited in its travel and we still have scope of measurement on that sensor, we're actually able to measure that input beyond that threshold point. So if you do want to absolutely slam on the brakes and push through that second stage, you do actually get a higher reading than if you were to just push to the threshold point every single time. And that is something that is fundamentally different about using these pedals, even though they are position-based, to pretty much any other pedal set that I've ever tested at this kind of price point. And what that means in a practical sense is that it's a very versatile set of pedals. And I'm going to be really interested to see whether people actually feel the need after using these for a while to upgrade to that load cell based configuration, because I just don't really see it as being a massive advantage here. I think that this does a phenomenally good job for the price that you're paying. And I certainly don't say that lightly. Pedals are the most important thing on your sim rig. If you don't have a good set of pedals that are going to allow you to brake consistently, that is always going to be a limitation in your consistency and overall speed. And so many of these entry-level bundles just come with absolutely garbage pedals, which, are okay for the money, but ultimately you're going to need to upgrade because they are a very severe limitation overall. Whereas these, I think they have done a really good job. I think the only criticism I really have here is just the difference between the weaker spring and the stiffer spring is very profound, and there's not really any adjustment range between the two of them. Whereas if you upgrade to the load cell, you get a lot more finesse in the overall adjustment. So you're either limited to a relatively short throw with quite a stiff pedal or a relatively soft pedal with a lot more throw. But yeah, I know I'm being overwhelmingly positive about these pedals. There are some things that I know some people aren't going to like. I don't like the idea of having the pedals offset like this if you don't go for the 3-pedal option. I love the upgradability here, but I think a lot of people are going to go, oh, that's kind of weird looking with just a hole where the clutch pedal would be. And they might want to even upgrade with that clutch pedal just so it doesn't look like there's something missing. But yeah, overall, the thing that screams out to me is that this has clearly been designed by somebody that knows what they're doing and knows what sim racers need, which I don't think should be taken lightly, particularly when you compare it to the pedals that come bundled with a lot of the other competitor products, which just don't cut the mustard and you end up having to upgrade them pretty quickly. So that is a quick rundown on the pedal hardware. What I want to do now is jump over onto the sim rig. We'll take you through the software side of things. We'll touch a little bit on the driving experience throughout that as well and how it relates to some of the settings that we'll discuss. And then we'll wrap everything up with our final conclusions on the driving experience and my overall thoughts on the Initium range. So let's take a look now at the Race Hub software, which is what you're going to be using for operating all of your Asetek racing or Asetek sim sports gear on your PC. So down the left-hand side, we've got a menu which highlights all the various different peripherals within the Asetek ecosystems, which are connected to your PC. You can see steering wheel, wheelbase, pedals, and LED. And you can see display is grayed out because we don't have a wheel on the rig right now with a display integrated. But yeah, nice tidy space that you can control all of your Asetek peripherals within the one little piece of software, which is nice and tidy. So we've got a button here for settings. We can just change some behavior on how the system starts up. We've got a game setup tab here as well for configuring the various different sim racing titles and games on your PC. Now, most of these don't require any setup. As you can see, there are a couple of games that you have to install plugins for and a few that you have to make a couple of manual adjustments for, but you can see it's all nicely listed here very conveniently, so you can make sure that everything is going to be working for you. Info tab here, we've got just information about bootloader version, firmware version, and serial number of each of your connected peripherals. Simple as that. You can click through to the Asetek store or Asetek support if you need to as well. And there is also a little prompt that will pop up down here next to the version number if there is an update available for the software or any firmware updates that aren't already installed. Now, one thing that I do just want to mention here, we did have a bit of an issue and I'm hoping that they'll be able to fix this pretty soon. When I tried to use other Asetek wheels on the Initium wheelbase, what we found is that they just weren't being recognized at all. And I was trying to troubleshoot this and I was thinking, well, there was only just a new firmware update that came out for this wheel just about a week ago. And I hadn't actually driven with any of the other wheels up until that point. So I thought, well, maybe there's just a firmware update that I need to install for those wheels. But there wasn't any way for me to actually update the firmware when I had them connected to the Initium base. They just weren't recognized at all. So I went and fired up my Invicta base, put those wheels on. It did show up that there was a firmware update available for those wheels. So I did that firmware update. Then when I put them back on the Initium wheelbase, they did work and they were recognized and there wasn't any problem, just with the exception of the Forte and Invicta wheels that have integrated screens. Those at this point in time at least aren't compatible with the Initium base, but all the other Asetek Sim Sports wheels do work. So a bit of a weird one. I'm sure that they'll have a fix for this relatively soon. But at the time that we did this review, at least, if you've got a Asetek wheel that is an older version of firmware, you're not actually going to be able to update the firmware to use it with the base unless you've got another Asetek Sim Sports base. So hopefully they get onto that and fix that quickly. I'm sure it's just a software bug, but yeah, definitely something that had me scratching my head for a little while there. So just one little potential thing to note there if you are an early adopter. But let's go through this now, starting off with the steering wheel. Now, obviously the settings available here will be determined by the steering wheel that you have connected. We have done detailed reviews of all this stuff before with the other wheels. So I'm not going to go through every single wheel and all of its options here for you today, just give you a basic rundown here. So we've got options for button configuration. You can click on each of the configurable buttons. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you can adjust. And this will allow you to adjust both the unpressed and pressed color, as well as the mode for each button. So you can adjust them all together, or you can adjust them individually too. So if we click all of these guys off for now, and then just click on this guy, for example, if we want to say have it be red when it's unpressed, you can see that's now gone red, and then have it change to say white, for example, when it is pressed. You can see now when I push the button, it goes white. And if we want to operate it as a latched button rather than a momentary button, we can change it to latched mode. Now, interestingly, at the time that we're filming this, it doesn't stay latched as far as the light is concerned. So hopefully they can patch that relatively soon as well, or maybe it's intentional. But to me, you would want it to stay in the pressed color state when it's latched as opposed to when it's disabled. So we're going to set that back to push button for now, go back to orange and red like the other buttons. And yeah, if you want to change multiple buttons to be the same as each other at the same time, you can do so like this. So now you can see both of these buttons will operate as indicated. We'll change it back to how it was again just for now. So that is a quick rundown on the configurable buttons. The one down here as well, just in case you're wondering, is referencing the little light above it. So you can see again, it will change depending on its configuration. Like so. I actually kind of like that. I'm going to leave it in that setting for now. So then we have a brightness adjustment here as well. Pretty self-explanatory there. It does go all the way down to off if you don't like lights on your wheel. And then we also have the option here to make adjustments to our shift lights. So we've got a smooth transition mode here. We can change the various different colors. We can change how it operates for pit limiter, whether we want it to flash at optimal shift point, change the flash color. We can have a sound play through our headphones or speakers at optimal shift point as well if we wish to do that. And then we can also choose between a couple of different patterns here for our shift light. So you can see at the moment, it's going from left to right as is demonstrated on the wheel right now. If we go center to side, center to the sides, side to center, it's going to be the reverse of that, and then sim hub. So you can actually have the wheel controlled via sim hub. Now we're not going to go into the details on that in today's video. There's plenty of other reviews where we've explained sim hub functionality, but basically what it means is that each individual LED for the RPM strip becomes addressable in sim hub, and you can customize to your heart's content. So that is a nice little touch there. I'm going to set that back to left to right for now. And then we also have the ability to adjust our shift curve here. So if you want to make fine tuning adjustments to exactly what RPM level each one of these lights will light up at, you can do that. And we can also click on each segment here to change its color as well if you wish to do so. We've also got a couple of pre-baked non-linear response curves here too if you want to fiddle around with those. So that's a quick breakdown on the steering wheel. So then we click down on wheelbase, and this is where we make any adjustments to our wheelbase settings. So we start off with center calibration, pretty self-explanatory. You can set an offset center for a different wheel if you need to, depending on the quick release that you might be using. So that's, yeah, you just click on set center when the wheel is in the center. Pretty self-explanatory. We then, we'll skip over force feedback for now. We've got a couple of settings here for safety, so we can adjust our automatic centering strength if you're running older games that require it. We've got a setting here for safe mode as well as hands-off detection too. So if you need to have a little bit of extra protection there, if you've got young kids running on your rig or something like that, you have the options to make those adjustments there. We've got a little tab here for notifications too. So that will just be an audio notification when your wheelbase changes states for any reason. But this is where I'm sure you guys are going to be spending most of your time in the force feedback tab. Now there are a couple of pre-baked presets, one for F1 and one for GT. And then I've done a couple of custom profiles here just where we've been testing things out. So we've got a basic profile. You can see the tab here is selected for basic. And this just gives us our basic settings. So we've got steering range. So this is the rotation of the wheel. Goes all the way from 180 degrees all the way through to 1,890 degrees for truck sims. Most people are going to want to leave this set to either 900 degrees for most sims, but generally speaking, as long as you've calibrated your game settings to match the rotation that you have here, you shouldn't have any discrepancy between the actual rotation in the game and what setting you have here. Bump stop hardness. So this is the hardness of the bump stop when you reach the end of rotation. Being a direct drive wheel, it can spin infinitely. So in lieu of a mechanical bump stop at the end of the rotation like you would have on a belt or cog driven wheel, we have a software-based bump stop, and you can adjust the hardness of that depending on your preference. So in hard mode, it feels a lot stiffer. It's not like a complete dead stop at the end, but it does feel a lot stiffer than it would do at the softer settings. Pretty self-explanatory. We don't need to spend any more time there. Bump stop range. So if you want to have a little bit of extra rotation in the wheel mechanically before it hits that mechanical bump stop, but beyond the steering range or the output range, you can set a little offset here as well, up to 90 degrees in each direction. And I should mention as well, there are tool tips if you hover over each one of these that explain exactly what these settings do. So overall force, this is going to be the maximum output of the wheelbase under any conditions. With the 5.5 Newton meter output of the Initium wheelbase, I would recommend most people have this set to 5.5 or the maximum so that you're able to make use of the full dynamic range of the wheelbase. Then we have basic damping. This is going to add to the sensation of weight in the steering wheel at the cost of detail. So generally speaking, I would suggest starting off with this off and then wind it up slowly to match the feel that you're looking to achieve. And then we also have basic smoothing here as well. So this is essentially just a filter algorithm that's going to allow you to soften down some of those details if you're finding that the wheel's feeling a little bit too reactive or a little bit too robotic. So these are the basic features. If you're brand new to sim racing and you find the advanced features too overwhelming, this is a good place to start. But if you really want to extract the most out of the overall experience, then I would definitely recommend switching over to advanced. So we're going to switch to my test profile here now in advanced mode, and I'll take you through all of these settings in some more detail, including how they relate back to the driving experience. So in the advanced tab, you can see there are quite a few more things that you can tweak and adjust to fine tune your driving experience. We do have the same profiles here for F1 and GT3 pre-baked. You can of course create your own profiles, and you can also click on the little 3-dot menu here and import presets and export them as well if you want to share them with your friends. There's no cloud-based service here yet. That is something that they did tell me over a year ago now when we reviewed the Invicta wheelbase, that they were ultimately going to add to this software, but hasn't happened as yet. So just comparing that to some other ecosystems, we do see cloud-based profiles. So hoping that we see that soon in Asetek as well. So steering range, bump stop hardness, and bump stop range are exactly the same as what we just looked at before in the basic settings. So then we have high frequency limit, and again, we can hover over each one of these. Limit the frequency range of the force feedback. Lower values will feel smoother, but less detailed. So you can kind of think of this, if you're into audio, like a low pass filter, filters out the high frequencies beyond a certain threshold. So at no limit, it's gonna just let through any frequencies that's outputted through the game data. If you limit this, then you can see it goes down in steps down all the way to 100 Hertz. Now, I wouldn't recommend anybody go below probably 2500 Hertz at minimum. If you are finding that you feel a little bit of a buzz in the force feedback, ripple strips just feel a little bit too sharp and detailed, you can filter some of that detail out here. But generally speaking, I would recommend most people start off with no limit and then wind this down if they're finding that the wheel just feels a little bit too granular in some of that detail. But I think that they've done a really good job here with these Initium bases of giving you a really good raw sense. And that goes for all the different driving sims that we tested this on as well. So that worked really nicely. So yeah, for me personally, across all the various different titles, I didn't really feel any benefit to limiting that at all, but a good option to have for those who might feel differently from me. We then have a damping adjustment, pretty much the same idea as what we talked about before in the basic settings. Again, I would start off at the lower end of the spectrum and then slowly working your way up until you find the right compromise for you. You will find that adding more damping will numb down the steering sensation overall. And because we are only dealing with a 5.5 Newton meter wheelbase here, at least without their boost kit, which we don't have available yet, you will find that if you start to go too crazy with the damping, the wheel will start to feel a lot more vague than you might like. And again, because the algorithms are so good here, you don't need to run a whole lot of filtering to make the wheel feel natural, unlike some other ecosystems these days, although the gap is definitely closing up. Some other ecosystems, you do find that you need to run a little bit of filtering to get rid of some of the robotic feeling, and that comes at the cost of detail then. But with the Asetek bases across the entire spectrum, including the new Initium base, that isn't such a big deal. So lower is generally going to be better for most people, I would think. Friction just gives you the sensation of a little bit of extra weight behind the wheel, again at the cost of detail. So you don't want to go too crazy with this. You'll find that if the motor is too busy trying to generate that sensation of friction, it takes away from its ability to be able to produce some of those other more granular effects, as well as giving the sensation of the actual movement of the car, steering rack, suspension movement, and so forth. So again, I would suggest running this on the lower end of the spectrum and then winding it up as you see fit. Inertia kind of works hand in hand with friction. So this gives a sensation of continued movement in the wheel as you rotate in a certain angle, because obviously, in a real life car, the steering rack, the wheels, the tires all have weight to them, and those will generate inertia when you're turning the wheel. So they're going to tend to want to sort of continue to move in the same direction as you turn the wheel. So this gives you the ability to simulate that effect. But again, the higher you go with this, the more it's going to pull away from the wheelbase's ability to produce some of those more granular details and things like suspension details. So you don't want to go too crazy here. Cornering force adjustment. What this adjustment is going to do is essentially just adjust the linearity of cornering forces through the wheel to allow the wheelbase the capacity or the dynamic range to generate those finer detail effects like we were discussing before. So again, generally speaking, on direct drive, I would recommend leave this turned off, but because we are dealing with a relatively low powered base here, you may find that you lack a little bit of detail in some corners. Say for example, you're going around a long corner and you bump up over a ripple strip, you may find that if the entire dynamic range of the wheelbase is being used up by generating just that corner force, you do start to lose a little bit of detail there and some of the more granular stuff. So this will allow you to adjust for that if you see fit. But across all of my testing, I found that I was absolutely fine running the cornering force at 0, as long as I wasn't running into clipping by having the signal coming out of the game up too high. So that should be absolutely fine. But again, experiment to your heart's content. Overall force, this is exactly like what we saw in basic settings before. Again, I would recommend leaving this set to 5.5 Newton meters, so you're taking full advantage of all the dynamic range available on the wheelbase. Only exception to that would be if you had small children running on your rig, that you want to limit the output so they don't injure themselves. Because believe it or not, 5.5 Newton meters is strong enough to break a finger if the wheel whips around on you, or even a wrist or a hand on a small child. So it certainly isn't a toy, even though it is a more entry-level direct drive wheelbase compared to some of the stuff we've taken a look at over the years. Torque behavior prediction. So this is like an interpolation filter. Adjust torque behavior prediction to counter low force feedback update rates. Lower settings add more responsive steering but may feel notchy. Higher settings feel smoother but may overshoot force feedback peaks and feel rubbery. So this isn't such a big deal these days. Most sim racing titles now have higher sample rates, so the force feedback is updating more times per second. But in cases where you may find that the force feedback feels a little bit robotic because the sample rate isn't high enough, you can crank up this torque behavior prediction. And what this is essentially doing is interpolating or creating data to fill in the gaps between actual samples coming out of the software. So you can wind this up if you find that the wheel feels robotic, but it will start to feel more rubbery as it was describing before. So in all of my testing, just like what we found with the La Prima, Forte and Invicta bases, I just left this set to off or 1 at the absolute maximum, and it felt absolutely fine to me. So I'm going to set that back to off for now. Torque acceleration limit. So this limits, if you want to, the responsiveness of the wheel. So if we hover over the tooltip here, adjust the limit for how fast the torque can change. Lower values limit the rate of change. This will soften the driving feel and make the wheelbase less active. This is also known as slew rate limit. So there's a lot of talk about slew rate at the moment. In very simple terms relating just purely to the driving experience, slew rate is effectively how quickly the wheelbase can react to changes of direction. So say for example, you're going around a corner and you suddenly get hit from the side and the car lurches the other way. You want to have that react quickly enough that it actually simulates what the car's doing and there's no delay in the wheelbase actually catching up with the movement or the command that's coming out of the game. So if you do find that the wheel just feels too reactive for you, you can set a limit here. But given that this is a more entry-level direct drive wheelbase, the overall slew rate isn't as high as what we see with some others. So there was certainly no scenario in my testing here where I felt the need to decrease this from its maximum, because we are dealing with something here that's more limited to begin with. So yeah, I would suggest leave this on maximum and just decrease it if you find the wheel is feeling too overreactive for you. And then finally here, anti-oscillation. So if you're finding when you're driving down straights, the wheel starts to want to do these ones, you can add a little bit of anti-oscillation here to tame that down. This is basically just counteracting overshoot, but increasing this will have a damping effect on the overall driving experience. So don't add anything here unless you feel you have to. I would actually suggest starting off at 0 and then working your way up, as we've said before with some of these other settings. So that's a quick rundown on each one of these settings and their impact on the driving experience. So before we take a more detailed look at the pedals, let's just quickly touch on the LED page. Now, with this particular bundle, it is only relating to the LEDs on the steering wheel. If you have other Asetek Sim Sports gear on your rig, which has integrated LEDs, those would all be controlled through here as well. So we've got lights that can flash on for assists. So when ABS kicks in, car spotter, device input, ESP, or traction control active, those will all be referenced on the wheel so you can see when those are activating. Flag status for the track as well, so black flag, blue flag, and so forth. Brightness, pretty self-explanatory, just adjustments here for the buttons, shift lights, and idle mode, and then the idle mode selection too, so you can see how the wheel will actually operate in idle mode here. You can adjust the brightness and you can have it set between a whole bunch of different effects here just when the system is sitting in idle. So pretty cool. I generally, to be honest with you guys, just leave it on none because I don't like to have things flashing in my face. But yeah, there's some pretty cool patterns here. If that is your kind of thing, I might leave it on Sim Sports just for now. So let's move on now and take a super quick look at some of the configuration options available for the pedals. Now, we already touched on pedal calibration before as it relates to the mechanical adjustment of the pedals. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. Just want to run you through a couple of quick details. We do have adjustments here for our upper and lower dead zone. So if you're finding that the brake application or throttle application isn't quite reaching 100% when you push the pedals to their maximum full scale deflection, you can add a little bit of dead zone there to make sure you are always reaching 100%. Usually this isn't something you need on a load cell or hydraulic brake, but on a position-based brake like what we have here, it is important. And then on the low end as well, if you have a habit like I do of resting your foot on the brake pedal, you can dial in a little bit of dead zone at the bottom there too to make sure that you're not dragging your brakes under normal driving conditions. So I normally just leave both of these set to 2 on the top and the bottom, and that would generally just allow for any sort of bad habits as well as any kind of sensor drift that might occur over time. We then have a button here to calibrate each of the pedals. Very simple and straightforward here. Just press calibrate, go to maximum, go to minimum, click complete, and you are done with the brake. you're going to push it to the maximum amount of force that you would ever want to apply. But as we just explained before, that will depend on the configuration. So go back and watch that part of the video if you're wanting more information on exactly how that works. Then we do also have non-linear pedal maps here as well, if you wish to set those. So there are pre-baked curves here for less aggressive throttle application. So say for example, you're driving a Porsche 911 Cup car and you're finding that you're braking the back end away on corner exit all the time, you could set a curve like this. If you're driving something like an MX-5 that is less powerful and you're wanting to get maximum power out of the corners, then you could set it something more like this to get on the power a little bit sooner. Not going to make a huge amount of difference for most people, but good to have those options there. You can do the same thing for brake, and if you did have the clutch option, which unfortunately we don't have at the time of testing, you would see the settings pertaining to that as well. That's everything I think you need to know about the Race Hub software. So let's talk more about the overall driving experience now and wrap things up with our conclusions. Okay, so I've been driving with this gear for the better part now of 2 weeks, putting it through its paces across pretty much everything that I could throw at it, from rally driving to drifting, street racing, GT3, Formula, pretty much everything. And yeah, I mean, I've got some thoughts. So yeah, first off, I think we need to get in our heads that this is more similar to something like a CSL-DD or a Moza R5, something within that kind of price bracket as you would expect, the price point of this one. But it's more similar to those products than it is to something like the Asetek Prima, for example. So while a lot of the fundamental characteristics do certainly give me those La Prima vibes, it's not on the same level as, it's not like it's the same as a La Prima wheelbase, but you know, cheaper and not as strong. So I wanted to make that very abundantly clear right off the bat here. But that said, we do get a similar kind of level of granular detail in the force feedback to what we do get on those more expensive Asetek bases. And you know, one of the criticisms that I've had of a lot of these more entry-level direct drive wheelbases over the years has been that the granular detail that you get tends to feel quite robotic. And what I mean by that is notchy and jerky and just lacking that finesse and that detail that you really get out of a more expensive, more refined wheelbase. And if you try to, you know, tune that or take the edge off that detail to make it feel more smooth and more natural, you end up damping down all of the force feedback to the point where things just feel vague and understated, and it's just a disappointing experience overall. And some of the really early direct drive bases, in my opinion, didn't even feel as good as some of the more high-end belt-driven bases like the Club Sport Wheelbase 2.5 from Fanatec, for example. I actually preferred the driving experience with that to the DD1 and DD2 when those first released. Now, over time, there have been a lot of refinements and improvements in a lot of those products. And where we find ourselves now in the market is that everything is a lot closer together in terms of the raw driving feel. And it's made my job really difficult because it's very hard to sort of try to not only pick differences between the different products when they're all so close, but also try to sort of understand the nuances and the characteristics of each individual product and what parts of that are characteristics of the physical hardware versus things that can change over time or be refined and updated through things like software and firmware updates. So where I land on the Initium base is it is very consistent across pretty much all sim racing titles. Once I had my force feedback settings dialed in the Race Hub software, I didn't need to make a whole lot of change between different types of driving, which always impresses me. I think really where this stands out is in its rawness. You know, you don't need to have a lot of filtering to bring out the characteristics of the motor. It just does a really good job. The algorithms are very clean and very well polished, you know, immediately out of the box, which to me says that it's a very refined product that's been developed by people that know exactly what they're doing. But that said, there are a couple of underlying characteristics of the motor that I did find were a little bit lacking. One of those things is that 5.5 Newton meters just isn't end game strength. And this isn't a criticism of the Initium specifically. What I'm trying to get, the point I'm trying to make here is that, you know, if you opt for a 5.5 Newton meter wheelbase, if you're looking to get more serious about the hobby or, you know, really start to sort of get into the competition side of things, you are going to find that ultimately at some point in time, you're likely going to want to upgrade to something a little bit stronger. And the reason for that is that the dynamic range just isn't there to produce the full spectrum of effects to give you the level of detail that really makes you feel immersed and connected to the car. Now, with direct drive wheelbases, typically we would run a linear response. And what that means is that the weak signals are always going to be a percentage of the strength of the stronger signals. And if you're looking at a wheelbase that's got, say, something like 15 Newton meters of dynamic range, you're able to produce those weaker effects at a level that is still strong enough to immerse you and make you feel what's going on with a lot of detail and, you know, fidelity. but then also produce those stronger effects on top of that as well. When you squish everything down into, 5.5 Newton meters of dynamic range as opposed to 15, those weaker signals are getting weaker as well. So everything is just scaled down, like turning the volume down on your stereo at home. So it certainly isn't game-changing in terms of the level of detail that it brings to the table compared to other competitor products, but it certainly feels that little bit more refined than a lot of those other products as well. But there is a slight underpinning, not necessarily graininess, but almost like fuzziness that I could feel underneath this. Some of the other wheelbases that we tested recently, particularly the VD4 and VD6, and the VD10 for that matter, from PXN, really surprised me with how smooth they were. Now, I don't know whether it's down to that encoder resolution that we were talking about before, remembering that this does have a lower encoder resolution than the Mozart R5 latest revision and those PXN bases. Those just feel a little bit smooth. They feel completely smooth in their rotation. When you're spinning the wheel around, you don't feel any hint of graininess or anything to even suggest that you're connected to an electric motor. Whereas with this, if you pay attention to it, you can just feel this slight kind of fuzziness as it rotates. And look, it's something that back-to-back testing, I can notice it. If I were to say to somebody, hey, go and have a drive of this thing and tell me what you think, I'd say probably, less than half of the people would even notice that it was there, when they don't have a direct point of comparison against another base at the same kind of, the same kind of price point. So it's certainly not a deal-breaking characteristic by any means. And I don't know, maybe it will be something that they can tune out with firmware updates later on, but it is certainly possible as well that may well just remain a characteristic with this wheelbase over time. So it's more similar to the CSL-DD in its smoothness than some of those other bases that are a lot smoother. But the refinedness of the actual force feedback detail is, I think, a slight margin above some of those other competitor products. But look, ultimately, as we've said in a lot of these reviews recently, there isn't really a bad choice in this sector of the market these days when it comes to just looking at the raw force feedback. So you really have to kind of extrapolate out, look at the other peripherals within the ecosystem, including the wheel and pedals that we're about to talk about. Look at the wider ecosystem as well, the selection of wheels available. Are there shifters? Are there handbrakes? All those kinds of things as well. And I think that's probably where Asetek is still a little bit on the weak side compared to, say, Simagic or Fanatec or Moser, for example, that have a much deeper ecosystem at this point in time. But they will flesh that out over time as well. So I'd say this is probably more a product that is suited to somebody who places a lot of importance and emphasis on the raw feel of the force feedback, the raw driving experience, and doesn't care so much about the wider ecosystem. Whereas some of those other products might be more suitable for people who, care more about aesthetics and, having shifters and a wide selection of wheels, and maybe willing to sacrifice that tiny little bit of refinedness in the detail to get those other things. So look, there isn't a perfect solution here. There are strengths and weaknesses everywhere. So that's the wheelbase. The wheel, look, it's ugly. That's my subjective opinion. Like I said before, if you had the choice between this wheel and this wheel next to each other on the shelf in a store, I think 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, people are going to choose this wheel over this one, just purely based on aesthetics and, race car look and feel. So I don't know why it is that that Asetek continue to sort of go down this path of, quirky looking wheels. They've shown that they can make beautiful wheels with the Forte and Invicta integrated stream wheels that we took a look at a little while ago. So, I love the look of those. But yeah, it's just a weird design language that I don't really fully understand. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people are going to look at that on a shelf and think, oh, that's ugly, I don't want that one, and end up going with something else purely just based on that first impression. So yeah, I hope that next time around, they might, just try to make it look like something you would actually find in a car rather than something that looks like a game controller. I get what they're trying to do here, but at the same time, I kind of don't get what they're trying to do here either, if that makes sense. But look, objectively, it is a good wheel. It's nice and lightweight. It's nice and versatile. It's got good rubberized grip. It's the perfect diameter at 300 millimeter for maximum versatility as well. The shifters are underwhelming, but otherwise, I think they have done a good job with the overall refineness here. And again, it does give that impression of being designed by people that actually understand what it is that is fundamentally important to sim racers. And that is more, on the ergonomic side. So yeah, I don't really have a whole lot more to add over what we've already covered with regards to the wheel. And pedals as well. I already sang the pedals praises. Those really are the outstanding part of this ecosystem. And as I said before, pedals are the most important part of any sim rig. Force feedback you can adapt to, for the most part, in most cases anyway. And the differences, like I said before, between different brands are, you are really clutching at straws to try and find any difference between them at all these days. Everything is good. Whereas pedals have been the weak point with all of these bundles that we've looked at this kind of price point up until now. And yeah, these pedals have absolutely exceeded my expectation in every regard for a pedal set of this kind of price. And you know, just when you look at the engineering, the material choices, the way that they've managed to lower expense and cut corners, but not in ways that actually impact the driving experience overall, I think is pretty remarkable. And again, it comes back to that whole principle of being designed by people that clearly understand what it is that sim racers want. So that is my review of the Initium range from Asetek Racing, or Sim Sports, or whatever you want to call them. Yeah, I think that unfortunately a lot of people are going to see this wheel on a shelf and think, oh, I'm not interested in that. And unfortunately, I think that's going to mean a lot of people that probably would have absolutely loved this bundle will end up buying something else. But that said, you know, the differences in driving experience overall, particularly when it comes to force feedback, are very small between the various different players in this part of the market right now. I think the biggest point of difference here is absolutely these pedals, which have absolutely blown me away from the money. When you consider the upgrade path available here as well that we discussed, I really think that they've knocked these pedals out of the park, and that is a very, very, very important piece of the puzzle. So I'd say overall, while the Asetek ecosystem may not be as well established as the likes of Moza and Fanatec, for example, in terms of the raw driving experience, this bundle presents the best value for money that I've seen right now. And again, when you consider that upgrade path available, it's very hard to find any objective reason not to recommend this. I think they've done a really good job of it, and in a market segment that is very stiff competition at the moment. So I think if you buy one of these bundles, you are going to be absolutely thrilled with it, as long as you understand the limitations when it comes to the force feedback. And of course, you do have the option of, you know, just buying the pedals on their own as well. $119 US is very, very good value for these pedals. And then you can go and run whatever wheelbase and wheel you want. You're not limited by that. And yeah, it's very, very, very good value if you look at it in that way as well. So I really hope that today's video has helped you out. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. Let us know in the comments down below what you think as well. And yeah, consider subscribing to the channel as well if you haven't already. Check if you thought you were subscribed, if you are still subscribed, because we do hear of people that you know, seem to drop off the list sometimes, and only about 30% of the people that watch these videos are actually subscribed to the channel. So I know it doesn't make a whole lot of difference to what you see in your news feed these days, but it does make a big difference in terms of what YouTube chooses to show new sim racers as well. So if you find the content valuable, please do help us out in that way. And yeah, if you do want to pick up this gear or any other sim racing gear, head over to boostedmedia.net, where you will find all the latest discount codes, affiliate links, as well as our buyer's guides, further reviews as well, to help you compare and decide what's going to be best for you. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.